I'm Shanker Singham with the Economic Policy Studies Group at the Legatum Institute. I'm the Director of Economic Policy and Prosperity Studies. I'm here with Professor Razeen Sally, who is a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Government at the National University of Singapore and the chairman of a public policy think tank in Sri Lanka, which is advising the Sri Lankan government on economic policy issues. And Razeen, you very kindly came in and did a presentation with us here at the Institute. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your ideas and presentation, particularly in the context of the paper and the studies that we are doing on 21st century trade policy tools. Our work is suggesting that actually there is a huge amount of economic activity that could be unlocked if countries move, first of all, continue to lower traditional trade barriers and trade tariffs and so on, but also move to deal with structural reform issues. And I'd like you to reflect a little bit on how countries can actually deal with these structural reform issues, which are, if solved, could lead to huge amounts of economic activity and innovation.
Yes, as you said, Shankar, that's a huge agenda. We have seen progress in the last few decades on traditional barriers to trade and foreign investment to some extent. But the biggest barriers by far now in the West and outside the West are much more complicated non-tariff regulatory barriers. And the political obstacles to dislodging them are proving to be much bigger, more intractable than the traditional trade barriers. But the prize is huge. The issue, I think, is very much one of competition. So competition remains repressed, and that relates to international trade and investment as well. When competition is repressed, innovation is repressed. Jobs aren't created, productivity levels remain low, and crucially, it affects inequality as well, because what all of this does is entrench the positions of inside elites who are comfortable with their rents and who are not exposed to competition from outsiders, including startups, SMEs, and so on. So how do we tackle all of that? I think the answer is to look at it bottom up rather than top down. There's the illusion that this enormous complicated agenda can be tackled in the first instance through ambitious international agreements or even regional integration. And that's not the case, because a lot of this is very local, national and context specific, and the politics of this tends to be very local, national and context specific. So it's got to start at home. I'm very fond of an adage of a defunct German economist that internationalism, like charity, begins at home, and that you don't build a house starting with the roof. Of course, the foundations must come first. Right. So doing things nationally, autonomously, unilaterally, to tackle both trade barriers as well as those domestic barriers in services markets, standards protectionism, public procurement, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, digital economy stuff, and so on. All of that has got to start at home, and not least to attract productive trade and foreign investment, and then be imitated by other countries when they see that one country is being successful. That's the traditional way it's happened, and I think there's still a lot of mileage for it to happen that way in the future. But of course, it's not going to happen just that way on its own. So a lot of these traditional trade as well as crony capitalist issues require some level of international cooperation. So in the second instance, as a helpful auxiliary, we should be looking at things like serious free trade agreements, what some people call deep integration free trade agreements, and also at the WTO. The WTO is a problem because negotiations have been stuck for ever so long. It needs to be unblocked. The multilateral system is important. But these days it's perhaps politically more relevant to think of getting together with like-minded countries that are capable and willing, not just to tackle traditional border barriers, but some of this deep integration, structural reform agenda as well. And the agreements that come to mind that are on the table being negotiated or have already been negotiated are the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which across Asia Pacific, which covers about 40% of world GDP, which is the biggest trade deal in 20 years, and the transatlantic negotiation between the Americans and the EU, stuck at the moment, but also ambitious, at least in content. So I think these are the ways to go. I would add one final point. Probably the best prospects for doing some of these serious reform experiments, again thinking bottom up, are not actually what you do at the international or regional level, or perhaps even at the national level. It's what you do at the subnational level. And this is where the whole agenda of urbanization and cities comes into play. Because I think experience has taught us that the most successful reform experiments are those that are done down below at closest proximity to the citizen.
Right.
And doing these experiments in cities and other governance zones, if you will, and having those successes emulated elsewhere within the country and abroad.
Creating demonstration models.
Yes, is something we should be thinking much more seriously about.
Well, interestingly, we have two programs at the Legatum Institute. One is we've advocated for a prosperity zone, which would be that deeper integration agreement across like-minded countries that believe in open trade and competition on the merits and property rights protection. But the other is this program of enterprise cities, which are zones that, as you described, would have better governance systems across, again, those three dimensions. And so it would seem that working at both those levels may be possible to deal with this sort of somewhat intractable problem of crony capitalism. One of the comments that you made today was that we're seeing a fair amount of Adam Smith, but we're not seeing a lot of Joseph Schumpeter. That, in other words, we're not seeing a lot of the creative destruction that leads to innovation. And some of this is linked to the lack of competition and the lack of, and consequently the lack of innovation. I'd ask you to sort of reflect a little bit on what the future could look like. So assuming that we were able to make progress in some of these areas. Robert Gordon has written a book essentially saying that we've exhausted all the innovation. Christine Lagarde has talked about the new normal of a very, very limited economic growth in the world. Do you agree with that, or do you think there's actually something else that is, that we're capable of achieving as human beings?
Yes, no, I mean, I would disagree with what seems to be conventional wisdom today, which revolves around innovation pessimism. And innovation pessimism almost invariably leads to calls for governments to be more interventionists in terms of slicing up the pie, the economic pie, as a means of redressing inequality and other social ills. I remain an optimist, not least based on my reading of history for what it's worth, namely that if the system is open enough, new inventions will be turned into innovations in the sense of being marketable, creating new products and services, creating new, more dynamic, productive jobs as well, and improving life chances for an increasing number of people around the world. to do that, as Schumpeter said, the system needs to be open enough to these swarms of new entrepreneurs who come in, swarm around new technologies, and unleash these gales of creative destruction, which dislodge the old, settled, sclerotic elite. And that's the way material progress, and with it social progress, has happened in the West in the past. Now, the problem is that in recent decades, this process has slowed down. So yes, we have new gadgets, but the gadgets have not led to the kind of innovation that we've seen in the past. That's one of Robert Gordon's essential theses. But where I would disagree with his overall thesis is that I think there's still huge potential in the future for this kind of innovation to happen with the new technologies that are emerging. But the crucial proviso is that our systems need to be made much more open to competition, essentially. And that requires governments removing bottlenecks, governments removing privileges from established elites, including big multinationals, so that creative destruction can take place. If that happens, there will be a supply side effect with much more investment in infrastructure for these new technologies, and there will be new services and new jobs created which we can't define at the moment by definition because they're in the future. So I think all of that is possible. We have sclerosis in the West that prevents it from happening. And I see an even bigger problem outside the West. So for all the talk of the rise of the rest, and of Asia in particular, the reality is that capitalism in these parts of the world still remains very imitative. It's about catching up with the West by imitating what the West has already done, rather than creative destruction. Now, that's okay if you're poor and still catching up. But if you've exhausted catch-up potential or come close to the frontier, as it were, and are middle income or high income, you need to innovate. And the problem, not least with the high income economies of East Asia, is that they're not innovating sufficiently. They're stuck in low productivity traps because their systems are closed, are not open enough. Now, that wasn't a problem when they were catching up so much, but it's a problem now. So it requires a rethink, not just of policies, but of the enveloping framework of institutions, including political systems. So that's a roundabout answer to your original question, what does the future look like? Well, if systems are made more open, and we have to think of political ways of making them more open, then the future is more liberal.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Razeen, for coming in today. We've very much enjoyed having you, and we welcome you back to the Legatum Institute when as soon as your schedule permits.
Thank you.
Thank you.